I'm Salvatore Babones, and today's lecture is The Globalization of Inequality since 1970. These days, we're all aware that inequality has risen dramatically in countries around the world in recent years, but sometimes we can miss the fact that that rise in inequality has had real impacts on the incomes of real people for a very long time now. This graph shows median male workers' incomes in the United States from 1860 to 2009. All of these numbers have been adjusted for inflation to 2009 dollars, so these are real income figures. As you can see, median income in the United States, at least for men, rose consistently from 1860 through around 1975. In fact, the increase was almost 2% per year in real terms. What that means is the average man in America made more money and more money and more money every year for 110 years. Now, we don't have very good time series data for women's incomes, but anecdotal evidence seems to suggest that women's wages rose at a similar rate throughout that period. Since 1975, however, there has been no increase at all in the average man's income in the United States. The average woman's income in the United States has increased slightly, but that's been due to a change in the composition of the women's labor force. Prior to the 1970s, working class women typically worked, but middle and upper class women typically did not. Since the 1970s, of course, middle class and upper class women have joined the labor force as professions like medicine and law and accounting have been opened to women. So there's been a change in the composition of the women's labor force. But if you look at specific women's occupations, in any specific occupation, whether a hairdresser or a primary school teacher or a nurse, if we look at long-term data for occupations where women have been allowed to work over the course of the whole second half of the 20th century, we find again that wages rose until 1975 and have stagnated since. So there's very strong evidence that everybody's wages in every kind of job have stagnated now for roughly 45 years in the United States. It's been a very long stagnation of average wages. As you can see in this graph, if the pre-1975 trend of 2% per year growth had continued post-1979, the average American male worker would be making $25,000 a year more than he is today. And I tell people that's your subprime mortgage crisis right there. The subprime mortgage crisis that kicked off the 2008-2009 global financial crisis can be viewed as a crisis of poor people having too much debt. But the opposite is also true. It can be viewed as a crisis of poor people having too little income. In the past, poor people's income would have risen consistently year after year, as it did in the United States from the 1860s until the 1970s. If poor people's income had continued to rise through the 2000s, we would have seen no global financial crisis because we would have found those people perfectly able to pay their mortgages when the bills came due in 2008 and 2009. Of course, if we use the modern trend in income, the missing income would be even larger. The long-term trend includes a long time period when economic growth was relatively slow from the 1860s through the 1940s. If we look only at the post-1940 period, the growth in wages during that period was so high that today the average worker might be making $40,000 a year more than he is in reality. In other words, typical wages should be double what they actually are. That's the price of rising inequality. Simply put, if levels of inequality today were exactly the same as levels of inequality were in 1975, the average American worker would have twice the income that he actually does today. We can see rising inequality in other series. These are Gini coefficients. The Gini coefficient is named after the Italian statistician Corrado Gini, who came up with an index that ran from a low of 0, perfect equality, to a high of 1, total inequality. And whether we study this at the household level, the family level, or the individual level, inequality has risen dramatically for as long as we have data. Inequality was falling until the 1970s, but since the 1970s, inequality has been rising. The only one of these series that seems to show a stabilization and perhaps a decline in inequality is the individual inequality series based on individual full-time workers. In fact, the inequality among full-time employed workers has gone down a little in the last 10 years. But the reason it's gone down is that increasingly people at the lower end of the job market, people who used to be low-paid full-time workers, are now only allowed part-time work. That is, people have been shifted out of the data series. They're no longer full-time workers, individual full-time workers. They're now individual part-time workers, sometimes with 2 or 3 different part-time jobs to make up a full-time salary. We can look at inequality in other ways. For example, workers' compensation as a percentage of total national income. The maximum point for workers' compensation was around 1979, 1980. Since then, workers' compensation as a percentage of all national income has declined substantially. And the decline is even stronger if we only look at wage compensation. So wage compensation maxed out in 1969, 1970 and has been declining ever since. The rising series at the bottom has been benefits compensation. Between 1970 and the early 1980s, benefits compensation rose dramatically, mainly because healthcare costs rose dramatically. But as you can see, even since 1985 or so, there's been no increase in workers' benefits because even though healthcare costs continue to rise, companies are cutting back on the healthcare coverage that they provide. And all of this declining benefits and stagnant wages has nothing to do with the overall performance of the American economy. When you graph American GDP per capita over the last 150 years, you find nothing but growth. In fact, an average annual growth rate of 1.80%. There are blips like a downward trend in the Great Depression and an upward trend in World War II, an adjustment to peacetime production, but the overall trend is clear and smooth and represents a continuous growth series of 1.8% per year. Interestingly, between 1860 and 1975, wages grew faster than annual economic growth. What that means is that for the first 110 years of our data series, 1860 to 1970, workers actually gained an increasing larger and larger share of total U.S. economic output. The share going to workers only stagnated after 1975. But the growth continued. A lot of people think that the economy has been stagnant for 40 years. It hasn't been the economy, it's been wages. So what happened in the 1970s? Maybe disco dancing started a craze for low-wage work, and after the 1970s and the invention of disco, the rock and roll era was gone, and with it went the age of rising wages. Well, we can't really know exactly what factors changed in the 1970s. So there are a whole list of things that changed in the 1970s, any of which may have impacted wages. Some people suggest the problem is the end of the gold standard. The United States ceased redeeming its currency in gold in 1972 under President Richard Nixon. post-war reconstruction was finally completed in the 1970s. So America may not have been damaged in World War II, and America may have adjusted to the post-war world by 1950, but Europe and Japan were still rebuilding all the way until the mid-1970s. So maybe the finishing of rebuilding in Japan and Europe, their full recovery, impacted wages in America. Maybe it was women entering the workforce. I mean, if you try to accommodate a large number of people into the workforce, presumably that would drive down wages for everybody else. Maybe it was the cut in top tax rates. The top U.S. tax rate used to be 92% in the 1940s. It dropped to 70% in the 1960s, and under Richard Nixon was cut to 50% in 1972. So maybe cutting taxes on the rich had some effect on shifting the distribution of income. But the explanation that I like most is something I actually call simply the revenge of the rich. That rich people in America got tired of their constantly eroding social status and started an explicit program of taking back the country. And in fact, there is some very strong circumstantial evidence that this is what happened. One of the most famous documents in the history of the struggle over the political economy of the United States was something called the Powell Memo. This was a memo written by Lewis F. Powell, who at the time was a lawyer for the Chamber of Commerce, the main business association of American businesses. Lewis Powell went on to become an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. In fact, he was appointed or nominated by Richard Nixon, but refused the nomination initially because he thought the pay for a Supreme Court justice was simply too low, and he wanted to continue his work as a corporate lawyer. 2 years later, Nixon renominated him, and he accepted the nomination that time and became, for the rest of his life, a justice of the Supreme Court. Powell was asked by the American Chamber of Commerce to come up with a plan for restoring the power of business in America. Up until the 1920s, big business in America called the shots in American society. But in the 1930s with the Great Depression, and then in the 1940s with World War II, business became relatively less powerful. Labor unions and other social movements came to dominate politics in America. And by the time of the Powell Memo, it wasn't just white male labor movements, but it was white female women's movements and African American women's movements and African American movements for civil rights. That it was people who had previously been disenfranchised or at least denied power in America who were suddenly making calls on American democracy that they should also have their voices heard. And the Powell Memo can be seen as an effort by, well, let's face it, primarily white, male, middle-aged, upper-class businessmen to take back power in the face of all these protests by women, by African Americans, by university students who wanted to shift power towards the female, the colored, and the young. Powell recommended that the Chamber of Commerce establish, first of all, a staff of speakers. This became a movement for the creation of pro-business think tanks in America. He said staffs of speakers because the concept of a think tank hadn't really yet solidified in the United States at that time. Now, of course, there's a think tank for every possible cause in the United States, and these think tanks have staffs of speakers who, at a moment's notice, are ready to appear on television or radio to present a pro-business point of view on any issue. So if you watch 24-hour news shows, you'll see at all hours of the day and night people representing business organizations who are available to talk to the media. Well, they're available because the American Chamber of Commerce and its associated organizations after 1971 started to pour money into the creation of think tanks to make speakers available to the media. He said that they should evaluate social science textbooks especially in economics, political science, and sociology, for left-wing biases, for anti-business biases, and should attempt to have those textbooks that had an anti-business bias removed from the curriculum. He said the chamber should demand equal time on campus for business speakers. That every time a anti-business speaker appeared on campus, a pro-business speaker should appear alongside or have equal time to present a point of view. So if a university invited a Cuban revolutionary to come speak on campus, they should also invite a representative of the American sugar industry to represent the opposite point of view. He advocated a balancing of faculties, that businesses and business organizations should go to universities and find out who was being hired. If departments at universities were hiring an anti-business or a left-wing sociologist, they should also be pressured to hire a pro-business or right-wing sociologist. And within sociology, we've seen as the kind of culmination of this demand for balancing of faculties, the rise of very business-friendly areas of sociology like organizational behavior, economic sociology, and social network analysis that all arose after the 1970s as businesses pressured universities to change the shape of how subjects are taught in the United States. And it's not just sociology. Political science departments had reduced funding for political philosophers and political theorists, and increased funding for people who did technical work on opinion research or the study of elections. Economics departments similarly had a shift away from funding for Marxian and other approaches to economics that were viewed as leftist. Even Keynesian economics, which was considered the dominant economics of the 1940s and 50s, became a target, and instead economics departments were encouraged to hire more neoliberal economists and post-Keynesian economists. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, the creation of graduate schools of business. Before the 1970s, you could hardly find such a thing as an MBA, a Master in Business Administration. The MBA became an important degree only after the 1970s as businesses started to demand that people get an education specifically for business. Prior to the 1970s, people who went into business were top graduates in the liberal arts. After the 1970s, there was an effort to make specific business education the priority for universities and, of course, for students who would want a job after they graduate. So the best way to make sure that students aren't infected by leftist or even balanced views of the world is to make sure that they aren't even in those faculties at all. Instead, the only faculties they hear from are pro-business faculties, because if you do a business degree, especially if you do an MBA, that does not include any content other than content geared towards the interests of business. The memo was very forthright. This is an interesting quote from the memo, and it's not taken out of context. The memo is available online. You can easily find it by Googling Powell Memo, and you'll see the memo has a view of the world that the American university system is full of communists who are trying to undermine the American way of life. So, to quote the memo, the FBI publishes each year a list of speeches made on college campuses by avowed communists. The number in 1970 exceeded 100. There were, of course, many hundreds of appearances by leftists and ultraliberals who urged the types of viewpoints indicated earlier in this memorandum, that is, left-wing anti-business viewpoints. There was no corresponding representation of American business, or indeed by individuals or organizations who appeared in support of the American system of government and business. Now, I remind you, this is not something written during the Red Scares of the 1920s or during the McCarthy era of the early 1950s and the Cold War. This is a document being written in the 1970s, a much more open, much more liberal era. Powell is implying that the American university system of the 1970s did not support the American system of government, which seems to me to be a bit paranoid. He goes on to say that the two essential ingredients of his strategy are, one, to have attractive, articulate, and well-informed speakers, and two, to exert whatever degree of pressure, publicly and privately, may be necessary to assure opportunities to speak. Now, publicly means going to the press and complaining about left-wing biases at universities, but privately means that he wanted business leaders and CEOs to go to their local universities and say, we want our viewpoint heard, or we won't fund programs at your university. As he wanted businesses to use their resources to twist the arms of universities to exclude anti-business viewpoints and to promote pro-business viewpoints. Now, the American post-war intellectual Richard Hofstadter had a term for this. He called it the paranoid style in American politics. And this is a famous essay that's also available online. If you just Google Hofstadter, the paranoid style. He said in this essay, the modern right wing feels dispossessed. America has been largely taken away from them and their kind, and they are determined to repossess it. As Hofstadter saw already in the 1960s, that business leaders in America, and for the most part white, male, middle-aged, educated, well-off Americans wanted their country back. They saw it disappearing to the Democratic majority of people of color, of young people, of women, of poor people, and they were tired of that. They wanted their country back, and they got it back. For the last 40 years, ordinary Americans have had simply no increase in pay. Now, they didn't go out and absolutely harm ordinary Americans, but by holding ordinary Americans back while they moved forward for 40 more years, the gap between the wealthy and the business elite in America and everybody else has risen to staggering proportions. And here's just how big. If we look at the share of the top 0.5% of American households, we see that it reached a minimum around 1971, 1972, 1973. During these years, the top 0.5% of American households took home just over 5% of the country's total income. So they had a disproportionate share of income, but just over 5% of total income. This was down about 40% from the share they took home in the 1940s. In the 1940s, it was around 8% of national income. And if we were to extend this graph back farther, we don't have good data back farther, but we know that inequality was much higher in the 1890s through the 1920s. The total decline is probably from somewhere around 15 or 20% of national income down to 5%. Well, when rich people see their incomes fall so dramatically, they understandably get upset. And you can see this very visibly if you just go to Manhattan's Upper East Side and you go to the old mansions that were owned by the rich people of the day of the 1890s and 1910s, the old Carnegie Mansion, the old Rockefeller mansions. These mansions were incredibly opulent statements of wealth drawn from all over the world, decorations from Renaissance Italy or from ancient Greece brought to their mansions in New York. By the 1950s and 1960s, these mansions had all been put in the public domain to become museums because the super rich could no longer afford to maintain these incredible properties that they had accumulated in the 1890s and 1910s and 1920s during their period of super high incomes. But then look what happens after the 1970s. In the 1970s, this decline in the income of the top 0.5% in America stops, and it's reversed. At first, the reversal is very slow. So at first, there's simply a end to the decline and a slight rise to 6% of national income going to the top 0.5%. And then in the 1980s, with the Wall Street boom of the late 1980s, the percentage of income going to the top 0.5% explodes. And in the 1980s and 1990s and early 2000s, it rises from 6% of total income up to 14% of total income, which is roughly where it is today. It more than doubles in just 30 years. That's an incredible gain for the wealthy that can't really be explained by any of the economic mechanisms that have been proposed. For example, women entering the labor force, may have an effect on incomes, but it shouldn't shift the income structure of the American economy so dramatically in such a short period towards the super wealthy. It's hard to imagine why more women being in the workforce would make the super wealthy super wealthier. It's hard to imagine why ending the gold standard would do that. It's hard to imagine why disco dancing would do that. It's hard to find any one economic explanation that would explain it, especially when you consider that the same thing did not happen in other countries. So if we look at the country culturally closest to the United States, the United Kingdom had a similar trend of declining share of the top 0.5%, only the declining share of the top 0.5% continued in the UK until 1978. Now, 1978 is remembered by middle-class British people as a terrible time in England. The underground tube workers were always on strike. The coal workers were always on strike. It was difficult to work or get things done because workers had so much power. They were constantly striking for higher wages and better benefits. But if you flip that around, most people are not middle-class professionals. Most people are tube workers and bus drivers and coal miners. So from their perspective, going on strike all the time, getting higher wages, getting greater benefits, from the perspective of ordinary people, the mid-1970s were the best of times in the United Kingdom. It may have been very annoying to be a lawyer or a banker in the City of London in the 1970s, but it was great if you were a coal miner in Northumbria in the 1970s. And there are far more coal miners than there are bankers and lawyers. That all changed in 1979 with the election of Margaret Thatcher. And you can see the reversal after 1979 in the income share of the top 0.5% in the UK. Many people equate Margaret Thatcher with the US President Ronald Reagan because they both came to power around the same time, and they were both very close friends. But in fact, the policies Margaret Thatcher put in place in 1979 and 1980 and 1981 in the UK were a parallel of the policies put in place by Richard Nixon in 1971 and 1972 and 1973 in the United States. That is, it's best seen as a 8-year lag behind U.S. policies. And in fact, inequality in the UK has been rising at the same rate as it's been rising in the U.S. It's just 5 to 10 years behind inequality in America. So a similar rise, but the level of inequality in the UK only reaches the U.S. levels of 10 years previously. but both series continue to rise. Well, if we see these kinds of policies, what are often called neoliberal policies, meaning a return to the policies that existed in the liberal era of the 1890s through the 1910s, if we see these policies moving from the US in the early 1970s to the UK in the early 1980s, do they also move to other English-speaking countries? Well, the shift in inequality in the US occurred in 1973, in the UK 1978, in Canada, another country very closely culturally connected to the United States, 1978 was the inflection point from declining inequality to rising inequality. Australia was a little later. In Australia, inequality declined until 1981 and then started rising after 1981. It took a little longer for the trend to hit New Zealand and even longer for the trend to hit Ireland. Ireland, of course, is the most European of the English-speaking countries, emphatically not an Anglo-Saxon country like the others, but a Celtic English-speaking country. So one by one, the English-speaking countries fell victim to this trend of rising inequality. It didn't happen all at once. We can't blame economic globalization for this because economic globalization hit all of these countries at roughly the same time. What we seem to see here instead is a diffusion process of high inequality social models moving from the United States, where they were born, to countries that are most culturally similar to the United States, the UK, Canada, and then to those that are a little more different, Australia and New Zealand, then even more different, Ireland. Well, does this diffusion model hold up for the other countries of the world? What about Japan? What about continental Europe? What about the rest of the world? Well, let's take a look at the rest of the world. Japan only had rising inequality after 1996. Now, Japan is one of the most globalized countries in the world. It's very well integrated into the global economy. Of course, its export products and autos and electronics are known around the world. Yet, Japan had declining inequality for 25 years after inequality started rising in the US. It was only in the 1990s, with a new set of economic policies in the 1990s, that Japan's inequality started to rise. Western Europe was even later. It wasn't until the early 2000s that inequality started to rise in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and other Western European countries. In Southern Europe, it took even longer. So Southern European countries, even more isolated from American trends of thought. Very few people in Italy and Spain and Greece speak English. In Southern Europe, inequality only started rising in the 2010s after the global financial crisis. So how can we explain these trends? I mean, 1980s inequality started rising in China and in Latin America. Can that be seen as a diffusion process? Those countries are very different culturally from America. Other areas, 1990s, Soviet Union and India, Africa and Indonesia, we don't have data. But can we make sense of these trends as a diffusion process? And I think we can. I'm going to focus on two theoretical perspectives in macro sociology. The world society perspective, most closely associated with John Mayer, and the world systems perspective, most closely associated with Immanuel Wallerstein. The world society perspective of John Mayer is a phenomenological approach to understanding the state and to state policies. Phenomenological means that essentially it's a culturalist approach, that policies are driven by norms and institutions rather than by economic interests. In the world society approach, there's an emphasis on demonstration and adoption. Countries and institutions see policies that work in other countries and they implement those policies in their own countries as well. So if the United States were to implement a policy that opens up an economy and reduces labor protections, other countries might see that policy working and adopt it for themselves. Immanuel Wallerstein's world systems perspective, by contrast, is a realist approach to understanding the state and state policies. That means there's an emphasis on material factors, on coercion, on the world market forcing countries to take positions. The world systems approach would suggest that if countries are opening up their labor markets and reducing protections for workers, they're doing it because globalization has increased competition, and thus protections are no longer sustainable in any one country. Okay. These two perspectives shouldn't necessarily be viewed as competing perspectives. They can be taken together and be viewed as complementary perspectives, but they do give us a language to look at the policy changes that occurred throughout the world in the last 40 or 50 years that led to rising inequality. So let's go back to this map of the world and trace through the phenomenological and the realist forces that led to rising inequality. The birth of the modern high inequality model in the United States was clearly phenomenological. As the Powell Memo suggests, rich Americans lobbied very aggressively for policies that would result in high inequality. The things they wanted were not surprising. They wanted low taxes on high incomes. They wanted an end to increasing minimum wages. The U.S. minimum wage today is less than it was in 1973, once you adjust for inflation. They wanted an end to unions. Well, unionization in the U.S. has fallen from some 40% of the workforce down to around 7% of the workforce being members of unions. So the rich Americans wanted a whole series of policies, and they got those policies. Nobody forced those policies on the United States. These policies were lobbied for through institutional change promoted by rich Americans. But let's look at China in the 1980s. China also gave up its communist system to adopt neoliberal policies. In China, this seems clearly phenomenological. China may have thought that communism wasn't working, but they had a clear choice. I mean, they could adopt U.S.-style market-friendly policies, or they could adopt European-style policies. I mean, remember that in the 1980s, inequality was still low and falling in Germany, in France, in Japan. China could have adopted labor market policies and other policies that were similar to those that existed in Western Europe and Japan, instead of adopting policies of the kind found in the United States. China made its symbolic choice in December 1978 when the first international product that they allowed into China was, in fact, Coca-Cola. They opted for Americanization rather than Europeanization. And in fact, China has pursued American-style market-friendly policies ever since. Russia's a more difficult case. A lot of people think that the transition of Russia from a communist model to a American-style open capitalist model in the 1990s was driven by realist material forces. Russia had no choice. America outcompeted it in the global stage, and Russia had to adapt by letting foreign investment in, by privatizing its industries, by having a rapid change towards a U.S.-style free market. But even if communism wasn't working in Russia, it too could have chosen a German model or a European model. In fact, Russia was right on the doorstep of Western Europe. Several of the Eastern European countries adopted more German-style approaches, particularly Poland and, of course, East Germany itself, which was integrated into West Germany and so thus adopted a West German style of capitalism. But Russia implemented a very American approach. They called it the Wild East, by comparison with America's Wild West, an anything goes approach to capitalism that may have resulted in the kind of illiberal regime that Russia has today, but nonetheless was based on an American model of minimal protections for workers, maximal business for freedom, rather than on a European or Japanese model of highly protected labor markets. In Europe, in the Northern and Western Europe in the 2000s, there was a clear phenomenological shift as European leaders began to lobby for the introduction of American-style capitalism in Western Europe. And there are two incidents that are really emblematic of this. Two German companies, Daimler-Benz, the makers of Mercedes automobiles, bought the ailing American automaker Chrysler, and Deutsche Bank, the German bank, bought the U.S. bank Bankers Trust in the early 2000s. Both of these deals were ridiculed at the time for having no economic justification. These were very successful German organizations buying weak or failing American organizations. Especially the Daimler-Chrysler merger was heavily criticized, and in fact Daimler later spun off Chrysler back into bankruptcy because it did not want to have to deal with the obligations of running Chrysler. And Chrysler, as you may know, is now owned by Fiat of Italy. But when Daimler bought Chrysler, that resulted in immediate massive salary increases for its German executives, because instead of being paid on an European model where executives typically made about 20 times the salary of an ordinary worker, the executives of the auto company demanded to be paid on an American model, where the chief executive made 350 or 400 times the salary of a typical worker. The reasoning was that the chief executive of Daimler Chrysler couldn't possibly be paid less than the vice presidents at the Chrysler division. Certainly the chief executive would have to be paid more. So rather than lowering U.S. wages, they raised the German wages of their chief executives. And these two deals are emblematic because they were so transparently attempts to bring American-style executive compensation into German boardrooms, part of a larger effort to introduce American-style labor markets into Western Europe. By contrast, in the 2010s, the imposition of American-style free markets in Southern Europe was strongly resisted. There were massive street protests in Portugal and Spain, and especially in Greece, against the imposition of high inequality social models. So in the wake of the European phase of the global financial crisis, in the wake of the euro crisis, Southern European countries were forced to reduce minimum wages, to fire government workers, to reduce pensions, in general, to implement policies that were anti-poor and pro-bondholder, pro-wealth, pro-rich. But even that, we could ask, was that really realist or was that really phenomenological? The institution that forced these countries to implement pro-rich, anti-poor policies was the European Central Bank. These countries all needed euro loans from the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank imposed conditions. Now, the European Central Bank had a choice. It could impose conditions of austerity on the poor, reduce the salaries of government workers, or it could have introduced conditions of austerity on the rich. It could have introduced taxes on savings. It could have introduced higher marginal income tax rates. It could have introduced a tax on wealth or tax on property to pay for the problems, pay for the debts of these southern European countries. So while the crisis may have been realist, the policy choices made in response to the crisis represented an institutional choice on the part of the European Central Bank. There's a similar story in Latin America in the 1980s, where there were debt crises in Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and throughout the region. Here we see the bluntly realist imposition of policies. These countries needed loans from the IMF in order to pay their debts. And the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, placed very neoliberal conditions on those loans. Cuts in salaries of public sector workers, privatization of state-owned industries, cuts in pensions for retired people. Yet, just as in the Southern European case, we could ask, why did these countries accept that austerity? After all, they had other options. They could have increased taxes on their own wealthy people. They could have defaulted on their bonds, thus effectively having a tax on bondholders. Other choices were available. There was a realist crisis, a true material crisis that had to be answered. But the choice of who should pay for it, if Brazil has massive public deficits, or Mexico has massive public deficits that it can't afford, should the bill go to the poor or should the bill go to the rich? And throughout Latin America, the choice made was consistently the bill should go to the poor. Okay. What we are witnessing throughout the world in these policies that have led to rising inequality is a massive shift in the moral foundation of the state. In the liberal era, in the 1900s, most political philosophers would have argued that the state exists to protect wealth. The whole purpose of having a state is to protect wealthy people and their property from poor people. And this was reflected in the fact that outside the United States, pretty much every democracy in the world had a property requirement for voting. You only got to vote if you were rich enough, if you had property that showed that you had a stake in the government itself. Of course, non-democracies, which were most countries in the world in the 1900s, even more directly were countries that were run in the interests of a small, noble aristocracy, not in the interests of the broad population. Now, in the 1920s and 1930s, and then especially after World War II, we saw a strong shift, a strong moral shift from the idea that states should be run in the interests of a small propertied minority to the idea that states belong to all of the people. Now, maybe this shift started in the United States in the late 18th and early 19th century. Abraham Lincoln said in 1863 that America represented government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And after the Civil War, even African Americans were given the right to vote. In the 1920s, female Americans were given the right to vote. So in America, we may have seen very early a shift towards the idea that we the people, as the United States Constitution says, are the foundation of the state. That idea spread in the early 20th century to the rest of the world. Communism, for all of its problems, was certainly based on the theory that government rested in the interest of ordinary people, not in the interests of rich people or an elite. However much poor people may have suffered under communism, rich people certainly suffered much more in the Soviet Union and in China. We could debate whether or not poor people suffered at all, but there's no debate on the suffering of rich people in those countries. So the moral foundation of the Soviet Union and Communist China was the interests of the people. And, of course, in the Western European welfare states, the moral foundation of the state was based on the idea that the good of the people came first. Well, what we've seen since 1972 in the United States and since the beginning of the 21st century in many other countries in the world is a return to the liberal idea that government exists to protect property, protect corporations, to protect the wealth of the wealthy. And not surprisingly, the philosophy that promotes that view calls itself and is called by others neoliberalism. We shouldn't be surprised if people who call themselves neoliberals embrace a philosophy that, when it comes down to it, the reason the state exists is to protect property. After all, That's what liberals thought in the 1890s. Why shouldn't neoliberals think that in the 2010s? So what we're seeing is a shift from countries, states, that is the organized state machineries that govern countries, shifting from primarily protecting wage earners to primarily protecting wealth owners, people who are getting returns, getting rents from their existing wealth. A shift from government for all to government for the 0.5 or 0.1%. A shift from national democracy to a new global ideology of free markets and protection for wealth. If you look at the latest agreements being proposed by the United States, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP with the European Union, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP with Asian countries, you'll see that these are not really trade treaties. The main focus of these treaties is on protecting intellectual property and protecting investors. That is, these treaties are wealth protection treaties, not trade treaties. And so we're seeing a shift from governance at the national level, where we have democracies that ultimately have to answer to the people who live in those countries, to governance at a global level, where the top priority is protecting global wealth that may be invested in any particular democratic country. To understand this shift, we need to trace out the specific pathways that have led to the spread of high inequality social models. It really is not enough to try to come up with a single global economic explanation for why inequality is rising. There is no one magic economic bullet that explains rising inequality in all the different countries where it's rising. Instead, we can find specific policies that were changed at specific times in specific countries. So, for example, systems of taxation. I know that taxes were lowered in the United States in the 1970s and in the 1980s that led to a big shift in wealth towards people who earned high incomes. Those same changes are occurring in other countries today. A decline in the welfare state. Again, in the United States, there was a shift away from providing welfare benefits in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, in the 1990s under Bill Clinton, when under Bill Clinton, welfare itself, the program Aid to Families with Dependent Children, known as welfare in America, was disbanded. The entire program dismantled. The UK has seen a similar reduction in the obligations of the state towards its citizens, and in European countries there's strong pressure to reduce the promises of the welfare state. Privatization. In country after country, state-owned industries have been sold off to private investors. We could argue about whether or not that is economically desirable. What we can't argue about is the impact on wealth. Certainly, companies owned by private investors result in lower wages for workers and higher rewards for owners and managers, thus exacerbating inequality. Education policy. In the United States in the 1970s, it was virtually free for most people to go to universities. They had to pay a small nominal tuition at state universities, but if they were poor, they could get a federal grant that would cover that nominal tuition and even some of their living expenses. Today in the United States, everybody except the very rich have to borrow to go to school. Thus, not only do they have much higher tuition rates, but throughout their lives they have to pay interest on the tuition that they were charged to go to school. In Australia and in the UK, there have been similar, though not as extreme, pullbacks from government funding for education. CEO pay dynamics. In the United States in the 1960s, chief executive officers made about 20 times the average salary of their employees. That's about the same as the level that existed in Europe at the time, and it's about the same as the level that continued to exist in Europe and Japan until the 1990s and early 2000s. Yet in the US today, CEO pay is typically 350 to 400 times the pay of an average worker. Does that mean that American companies are now incredibly better run by much more efficient CEOs than previously? It's hard to imagine that CEOs today are 20 times better than they were in the 1950s, 60s, and early 1970s. Corporate governance has shifted to be much less democratic. In the United States, it's virtually impossible for shareholders to impose their will on management. And even in Germany, which has long had co-determination, meaning equal representation on boards between workers and management, there have been strong pressures towards increasing management control of corporations. Corporate welfare measures are passed everywhere, so government policies that provide tax breaks and incentives to corporations to move to their countries shift wealth very clearly from the citizens of the country to the owners of the corporations and the managers of the corporations that get those incentives. Competition policy. Government policy, especially in the US, but also around the world, starting in the 1900s and 1910s, was strongly geared towards breaking up monopolies, towards ensuring that markets were highly competitive. Well, now there's very little effort to ensure competition in markets. Google has a monopoly, Microsoft has a near monopoly, Apple and Samsung have a duopoly of mobile phones. In market after market, we can find monopolies, duopolies, or triopolies, a small number of companies that control virtually the entire market. It used to be government policy to simply break up these companies. Even if they had done no wrong, they would still be broken up just on principle, that nobody should have that much power in the market. Of course, eliminating competition policy has the effect of eliminating competition, and as a result, the elites who own those companies and manage them make much more money. Ordinary consumers pay the price for that. And probably most importantly, there has been an incredible shift in wage-setting institutions. The perfect example of that is the minimum wage in the United States. In the United States, minimum wages were rising very rapidly until 1973. The minimum wage in 1973, if expressed in today's dollars, adjusted for inflation using the official Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, would be around $23 an hour. But the actual minimum wage in the United States is $7.50. Not only that, even the most ambitious programs to increase the minimum wage in America, the Fight for 15 campaigns occurring in major cities around the U.S., even the very most ambitious requests of labor are for a $15 minimum wage. Yet 40 years ago, the minimum wage was the equivalent today of $23. And to be very clear, that's the equivalent of $23 in 1973, but the economy has doubled since 1973. If you wanted the minimum wage to actually keep up with productivity growth instead of just keeping up with inflation, it would be higher still. Most of these pathways from 1970s America can be traced out from the America of the 1970s and early 1980s into the rest of the world. No matter what country you're from, if you can find a policy in your country that is benefiting rich people and corporations at the expense of ordinary workers, you can almost certainly trace an antecedent back to the United States. These U.S. policies have demonstrated the way for rich people and powerful people in other countries, have demonstrated the way for them to seize a greater portion of their own national wealth as well. To some extent, the United States has actively participated in spreading these policies, but for the most part, national elites in other countries have seen the benefits for themselves. That is, they've seen a demonstration effect in the United States and have mimetically copied that American policy. In other words, the broad contours of the spread of U.S.-style wage-setting institutions and other high inequality institutions, the broad pattern, I think, is macro-phenomenological. People in countries outside America seeing the demonstration effect in America and wanting to follow those policies themselves. Even where realist forces have forced a sudden choice of policy, the choice that was made was shaped by phenomenological forces originating in the United States. In the end, it really is just about greed. Look, the simple fact is that inequality is rising everywhere we look. There have been studies of inequality in sports teams, which is on the rise in the same way as inequality in society. It's hard to come up with any model of globalization or women joining the workforce or the gold standard that would have any impact on footballers' salaries. Yet inequality among football players, both European football and American football, has increased dramatically over the past 40 years. It doesn't matter where we look, inequality is rising, which is what suggests it must be a change in norms, not a change in underlying economic factors. And perhaps the most direct illustration of rising inequality norms is the pay of CEOs and other top leaders at corporations. Now, these data are a little old, but I did a small study of a 13-year period from 1993 to 2006, using data on Fortune 500 companies. In the United States, all publicly listed companies have to report the salaries of their top 5 paid executives. Typically, the highest paid executive is the CEO, and then the others are executive vice presidents or chief financial officers. Among American companies, the average American CEO got a raise of 8.8% per year over that 13-year period. Now, CEOs set the salaries of everybody underneath them. The CEO, for himself or herself, took a pay increase of 8.8% per year, but only gave their second in command, on average, a 5.4% raise. Third on command got 5.2, fourth in command got 5.0, fifth in command got 4.6 on average annual raises per year. Now, this is a remarkable replication of rising inequality in the world. There's not just inequality among workers, among football players, among ordinary men and women. Even among the super elite, the top paid executives at the top corporations in America, there's increasing inequality. And not only that, increasing inequality in a very strict graded way. People who are number 4 at corporations are rising up and away from people who are number 5 at corporations. Everybody didn't just get a 5% increase leading to the same inequality replicating itself year after year. Instead, there's a clear ranking in salary increases. Whoever has the most power gets the most. And of course, the CEO, having the biggest power differential over the others, got an incredibly higher increase than the other workers. Thanks for listening. I'm Salvatore Babones. You can find out more about me at salvatorebabones.com, where you can also sign up for my monthly newsletter on global affairs.